Hello, everyone. My name is Anna, and I'm welcoming everyone here today for the first Research Design Analysis Core seminar. So I'm really excited today because we have a very engaging talk. Our presentation will focus around participatory research, a coalition-based consultative model. And we do today have a really fantastic coalition of presenters. And so what we'll have today is working with us, we have Shoba Ramanadhan, who is an assistant professor in the social and behavioral sciences at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. She is also the co-director of the Outreach Core for the UMass Boston DFHCC partnership. Joining her today, we have Cruz, who is a behavioral health clinician at the Lynn Community Health Center. And also joining us is Elana Brochin, who is the program director for health equity at the Massachusetts Association of Community Development Corporations. So without further ado, I'm going to let them take over from here. And thank you all so very much. Looking forward to the talk.
Great, thank you, Anna. Everyone can see this okay? Great. Yeah, so we would love to have all of you engaged in a discussion with us as we share a fairly recent model that uses a coalition to offer consultations to increase equity in research. So what we'll do today, as I get started, I just want to acknowledge our community advisory board for the U54 partnership, the Outreach Core, and also the Community Coalition for Equity in Research. And you'll see all the wonderful members of both of these groups, in our presentation, and we're funded by NIH to do this work. So what we thought we could do for you is do a round of introductions of those of us who will be speaking, and we'd encourage the rest of you to throw, your name, your organization, and something fun you want to do this spring into the chat, just so we can all kind of get to know each other a bit. I'll give a very brief overview of the U54 Outreach Core because I know we've got a number of people on the call who could benefit from some of the services and may not be aware of what all we do. We'll go very briefly into the ways we think about participatory research and this idea that there are many levels of engagement we can use. Like we often hear about community-based participatory research or CBPR, and there's this idea that that's sort of the one way you can do engaged research. There's actually a wide range of ways, and so we want to show you a different way that we've been using in our Community Coalition for Equity in Research. And so then we'll actually share the process that we use for research reviews, again, with the idea of promoting equity and community engagement in research. And then we've left time at the end for discussion, but we've also got, built-in places throughout to have you jump in and share your ideas, and we would love that. So, again, in the chat, and then when we ask for your feedback, we'd love this to be interactive, especially, on a Friday, on a bright, sunny Friday. We want this to be as engaging as it can be. So Glavie, would you like to introduce yourself, and then we'll let Elana do the same?
Sure, great. Well, good morning. I'm super excited to be here. My name is Glavielinys Cruz, and I am a behavioral health clinician at Lynn Community Health Center. I'm a bilingual bicultural clinician, and I do see children, adolescents, and young adults for both individual psychotherapy and also group work. And I'm also a board member for the Integrated Center for Group Medical Visits, which is embedded in Kronos Health in Lawrence, and also Fidelity House, which is an organization that services children and adults of different abilities in the Merrimack Valley, which includes Lawrence, Haverhill, and Andover. So I'm really excited to be here.
Thank you. Elana, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thank you. So great to be here. My name is Elana Brochin. I'm the program director for health equity at the Massachusetts Association of Community Development Corporations. We are a member association of 63 nonprofit community development corporations throughout Massachusetts that all work in low and moderate income communities on economic development issues, primarily affordable housing. My background's in public health, so I'm really glad to have opportunities to connect as part of the Community Coalition of Research on Research. I'm really happy to be here to be sharing this work.
Great, thank you. So as promised, we'll just tell you a little bit about the U54 Outreach Core. So this is one of the cores, kind of like the Research Design Analysis Core that sits as part of the U54 partnership between the Dana-Farber Harvard Cancer Center and UMass Boston. You see our wonderful community advisory board here at the top, and Glavie is one of our advisory board members. And then we have a team that's split across UMass Boston and the Dana-Farber Harvard Cancer Center that works together to think about how we bring implementation science, community engagement, health equity, and capacity building work together to advance cancer equity in the state of Massachusetts. So the work that we do, we have our CAB that we just showed you, and our idea is to be able to engage community leaders as well as adolescents and young adults from underserved communities through our community advisory board activities and our advisory panels, so that the work that we're doing is always grounded in the realities of practice as well as the lived experience of folks who would receive cancer prevention services. We do a lot of capacity building work, so in community-based organizations and faith-based organizations, all around evidence-based interventions. And given that we are, funded by National Cancer Institute, we focus very much on cancer prevention and specifically alcohol and tobacco use, healthy weight, and HPV vaccination. Another goal of ours, and I see Tiffany Donaldson is on this call, she leads this effort on the UMass Boston side, is to train the next generation of Black, Latino, Brazilian, and Native scholars in community engaged research and outreach. We serve all communities, but the communities highlighted here are the ones that we are focusing on based on our community partnerships and also history of engaged research with these communities. And this is sort of Greater Lawrence, Greater Boston, but again, our catchment area is the entire state of Massachusetts. We partner with our CAB to co-create dissemination products and services. So we've done things like science cafes where we bring researchers and community members together to talk about the latest and greatest in cancer prevention research, or broader issues of social justice and health equity, and thinking about science and health research careers for young people who are underrepresented in the cancer research workforce at this time. And then finally, and this is a pitch to all of you who are U54 researchers, part of our charge is to support other researchers and cores when it comes to community engagement, health equity, and knowledge translation. So some of the services we offer are things like consultation on how to build a community advisory board, how to think about recruitment, stipends for participants, stipends for organizational partners, all that kind of stuff, is the nitty-gritty of how we do engaged research. We're here, and part of our mandate is to support all of you. So if any of you are interested in taking advantage of our services and haven't yet, please reach out. So I imagine most of us have heard about engaged research approaches, but just to make sure we're all on the same page, this is one of my favorite definitions of community-based participatory research. It highlights this idea of collaboration, involvement throughout. So it's not, oh, a researcher has an idea and then comes to the community, say, this is what I'm going to do, and here's my brilliant idea. It's really engagement across. It takes an assets focus. So this idea of strengths is not often how we, is not always the way we approach public health, right? We often come with this deficits frame. And so this is really saying we take an assets focus and see what resources exist, what knowledge exists, what abilities exist, and how do we leverage those for the good of the community. It starts with a research topic, again, of importance to the community, and combines knowledge with action. So you can't write a journal article and call it a day. There has to be some sort of local action, local change that happens to consider it really successful. And then finally, this idea of creating social change with the goal of addressing health outcomes and eliminating health disparities. We might frame this as more of eliminating health inequities at this point, but this is 20 years old. And so with this idea, as I said at the outset, we often think about this sort of like CVPR or BUST model, so that if you're not in this sort of collegial space where there's sharing of power, everybody's agreed on the project direction, benefits are as equal as possible, that the other alternative is to not be engaged at all. And I think that's a loss, right? We have opportunities to think about a collaborative model where maybe the academics have funding in a certain area, but really want to have deep engagement with community and practice partners to make sure that the work that's done is the greatest impact and most relevant as possible. Or you might have a consultative model like we're going to show you today, where you've got this sort of targeted use of experts' time, right? So sometimes you have national leaders who could be on your advisory committee. They can't meet with us every month, but they could meet with us, say, quarterly or twice a year and give us that high level perspective, that bird's eye view, because they're seeing things from such a different place and have such a different expertise from a practice or community standpoint, that we're able to get so much out of this as researchers, but with a reasonable burden to the community and practice partners. So I will turn it over to Glavie.
Yeah, before we start talking about more in depth about our model, we are actually very curious to hear from you and what you have already engaged in and what types of participatory research you and your various organizations have done. So we can take a couple minutes now to really open it up to the floor and see what kind of research, participatory research you all have been engaging in. And thank you to those who have already been chiming in the chat. So what kind of research have you dabbled in, or perhaps what kind of participatory research do you envision you would like to participate in the future?
I can start by just saying, from the perspective of the Research Design and Analysis Core, we have the pleasure of being able to work with the Outreach Core. And I've spent, I would say that actually all my career, since I was over at the School of Public Health, learning about participatory research and the benefit of truly engaging and embedding yourself in communities by watching Vish and folks like Sarah and Shoba work with these communities over time.
Yeah, I think that long-standing piece is always a challenge, and yet is one of our biggest benefits, right? Or for others who maybe haven't engaged in that way, is there something that's holding you back?
I can start just on a few. I work on a variety of different research projects, and I think one thing that sometimes the PI struggle with is just the starting point in terms of how, if they don't have those existing relationships in the community, if they're trying to engage in research on a new topic or with a population they haven't necessarily had a long-term relationship with, I think one of the big hurdles that they're facing is just kind of, what are those initial steps? How do we even start?
Absolutely, very, very valid points. Anyone else? All right, well, thank you, Carol and Anna, for chiming in.
Sorry about that. Okay. We'll move to our Community Coalition for Equity in Research and share a little bit about what we've been thinking about. So, I think, was it Anna who just said, folks don't necessarily know where to start? I think that's been one of the greatest challenges we've seen, is that researchers often have an idea and then they, kind of get pretty far down the pike and then realize, oh, okay, now I need some partners for this. And then they start, sort of having already done a lot of the work, seeking partners, right? So that the opportunity to really take feedback and integrate it into the research proposal in a meaningful way has kind of been lost. So, as an example, Karen Emmons, who's one of the leads on this coalition, was finding that, the outset of the pandemic, she was being contacted by a number of Harvard-based researchers saying, hey, we want to do work on COVID and we're looking at equity, and can you get us, quote unquote, into the community? As if somebody has some kind of magical key. But also this question of, well, who all should be doing community-based research, if they're just showing up for the first time and things like that. So with this challenge of researchers sort of engaging too little and too late, she and others saw this need for a standing resource for community input. So that way, if you are a researcher who's new to engaged work or new to community-based work, you have a place to go and start the conversation around, how should I be thinking about this? What already exists in the community, what resources are available, things like that. And at the same time, from a community benefit standpoint, having a standing set of partners who can bring information back to the communities that are, the ones that they serve, the ones that they feel are highest priority in terms of, matching folks with services and opportunities. So the solution that the group came up with was to have this standing trained community coalition that reviews research proposals and helps researchers think through how do we increase health equity, how do we incorporate principles of community engaged research, and so forth. And other folks have done this. So at the Meharry Vanderbilt Clinical Translational Science Center, they have a model like this, where I think they have a standing panel of community members who review projects and talk about, sort of what kind of stipends do people need? How does this fit with the realities of people's lives? Things like that. And this model sort of draws on that, but focuses much more, I think, explicitly on health equity as the target, and also on, facilitating community engaged research where possible. So our core values are to share power and resources. And just to give you some examples of what that looks like, there's a collaborative model of leadership. So Karen Emmons from the Harvard School of Public Health and Michael Curry from the Massachusetts Association of Community Health Centers and the NAACP, they're the co-leads. And then there are two coalition members, sort of like on a rotating basis, who also co-lead the coalition, right? So there's real, balance then between the academic and community leaders sort of directing the process. We also created the rubric that you'll see in a bit together. So it wasn't just sort of like academics or community partners saying in isolation, hey, this is what research should look like. It was an iterative process that we went through together. We really try to promote community involvement in all stages of research. Again, this idea of asking, the community of interest, what are your priorities? What do you need, in terms of health resources? What kind of questions are you asking? And seeing where there can be integration and alignment. And not to be naive and suggest that we can always find perfect alignment, but at least that those questions are being asked, those relationships are being developed. We support co-learning among everybody involved. So we do these capacity building sessions so that we can all learn more about public health practice, community experience, how research works, all of these things. And the idea is that we are all as a group then, the academic and practice partners, sort of growing together in our ability to think about equity in research. We try to make an explicit attempt to center community strengths and resources. Again, that sort of assets frame, and really thinking about what already exists in the communities that researchers are saying that they want to, conduct research with. Are there engaged coalitions? Are there partnerships that folks could tap into? Sort of what community strengths can be brought to bear as part of this research. And then finally, we don't want to just have an impact on, one narrow study here and there. We're really thinking about, how do we build infrastructure in communities, and it's particularly those that are affected by, being marginalized and being excluded from opportunity. How do we create infrastructure for that flow of scientific knowledge, community knowledge, to kind of, be able to come together on a regular basis? And then we're also doing some work with like IRBs to sort of think about how do they promote equity, in their review processes. So this idea of can we make some systems changes so it's not just sort of one-off researcher by researcher, because that would be a pretty slow game. So this is our coalition. We have a tremendous diversity in terms of folks' practice-based experience, lived experience. We have some amount of geographical diversity across the state, although our Western Mass colleagues will tell us we don't have enough. But certainly we tried to have representation across the state. So there's 14 members. They include immigrant advocates, religious leaders, health department staff, civil rights and social justice agents, community development corporation staff. So that's you, Elana. Health center leaders, and community health and climate justice volunteers. So really a broad range of expertise that folks are bringing to the table. And they are coming together for 2-year terms and are paid stipends for their participation. So, while many of the folks here are volunteering their time in so many spaces for social justice and for health equity, this is, a paid position in terms of like a stipend being attached to it to, acknowledge the value that folks are bringing to the table. And so far, we've done some evaluations and gotten really positive feedback from both the coalition members and the researchers who have gone through the process. So, Elana, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Shoba. So I'm going to just do a simplified overview of the review process that we go through, starting with when the researcher is is tied into this process. So there's a lot of communication that happens before we as coalition members have the opportunity to see any materials or to speak with the researcher. And it starts by the researcher making the request to have their study reviewed by the coalition. And they're then offered support by the coalition staff, and the coalition staff will frame the incentives to the researchers as an opportunity to participate and to get feedback and to reach their diversity recruitment goals, and also to increase the extent to which their findings might be generalizable, because if the participants are more representative of the population affected, then their results are going to be more generalizable. The coalition staff identify researchers who might benefit from the coalition through various processes, including a community engagement program consultation service, through the Harvard Catalyst monthly newsletters, of course, through word of mouth, through academic networks, and also through coalition members. And so as a coalition, we have the opportunity, ideally, to review studies relatively early in their development process, as Shoba described earlier. So we want to review the studies while there's still an opportunity for feedback to be integrated into the study planning and into the study budgeting. And so the researchers are asked to prepare a few things in advance of a conversation with the coalition. First, they prepare a 3-page document, which provides details on study procedures, and we have a series of study design questions that they're then asked to respond to, so that everybody in the coalition has a sense of the project that they're doing. And then additionally, the researchers provide a 10-minute video in lay language to provide an introduction to the project, and as well as their motivation for the work that they're proposing. And the intention of that video is to complement the written materials. That way it allows for different learning styles. And it also gives us as coalition members exposure to the investigator speaking and interacting before we have a chance to meet them face to face. And we provide guidance to the investigator about how to prepare the video, and they receive sample videos and such before being asked to submit their own. And then researchers also are asked to provide if they have any questions that they want the coalition to be thinking about, any advice that they would benefit from for consideration. So after the investigators provide us with the materials, then we have the opportunity to provide feedback to them. So what we do is we take a look at the written and the video that the researchers have provided to us. We usually have 2 weeks to provide feedback, and we all make use of a rubric that we all develop together. So once we're going into the meeting with one another and with the researcher, we already have a really good sense of what some of the questions that we have for the researchers are, what some of the strengths of the project are, and also where we see more opportunities to integrate values of equity into the research itself. And also, of course, if the researchers provided any specific questions for us as coalition members, then we've had a chance to review those as well. So we have meetings once a month, and our meetings are very efficient. Because we've all done all of this prep work, and also because we have great facilitators for our group. So we have a pretty open discussion where we have the opportunity to reflect on all of the things that we've already gotten to think about. So strengths of the proposal, any questions that we have. There are often a lot of questions that we have just because we have a relatively brief introduction to the research, and also because ideally the research is in its very beginning stages. So there's some points of the research that haven't yet been established. So we often have clarification questions. And then also we usually have some points of places where we see that equity principles can be better embedded into the research plan, or ideas about how that can happen. So we spend about half of our meeting just in discussion with one another. And then we bring out the points that we want to highlight in the discussion with the researcher or researchers. And we also decide kind of who's going to be saying what so that it can happen in a straightforward and efficient way. And then we let the researcher in, and we so far have done this all over Zoom. So letting the researcher into the Zoom room. And we always start the conversation as I think, most conversations should be started by offering some positive things that stood out to us about the researcher's proposal. And there are always a ton of really positive things that we find. There are always really thoughtful projects that are coming our way. So that's always really fun. And then we get into some of the nitty-gritty questions that we have, and questions that the researchers have posed to us, where we might have some thoughts or feedback, and areas that we see that things could be tweaked. Another thing that I had meant to mention earlier, but which I didn't, is that if the researchers have supplemental materials, like if they already have consent materials or survey materials or other things like that, they're also welcome to share those with us so that we can give feedback on those. Then after we conclude our discussion, the researchers receive written feedback based on the rubrics that we filled out earlier. And there's also opportunity for future coalition involvement. Often some coalition members will volunteer to do a follow-up conversation with the researchers, often a more detailed conversation about some of the questions that they had, or also opportunities if there are supplemental materials that we just couldn't dig into in as much detail in the larger group conversation. There's a follow-up opportunity for that. So I've mentioned the rubric that we use, and Glavie is going to, in a moment, go through some of the things that we have in the rubric. But I'm really curious to hear from this group, just hearing, the half an hour, 20 minutes or so of this presentation, if you already have some ideas of, if you were making the rubric, what kinds of questions you might ask or what kind of items you might put in. There are no wrong answers.
And we're always tweaking things. So we thought we could also learn from all of you and see what we'll take back to the coalition.
I have a question, or an
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm wondering if it includes sort of support for the community.
Can you say a little bit more about that, Sarah?
Sure. So when a researcher is, wanting to work with people in the community, do they provide, do they recognize the time that's involved for the community participants or for the coalition?
Great. That's a great question. And Glavie is going to go into details about what's in the actual rubric, but I think that is definitely a thought that we have in terms of, what the burden on the community is going to be, what kind of support we can offer. And I think that that's also something that we want to continue to think about and to refine how we're thinking about and asking those questions. Thank you.
Thank you. I sometimes think that researchers don't realize all that's involved in, the time that it takes to actually, do the research or recruit the participants and the involvement with the community in that.
Yeah, I think that's definitely right. And also, what I have found is that in some cases, it's the same folks who are being recruited to different types of participatory research. And then it's like, people get survey fatigue or focus group fatigue or whatever else. So it's really important to be aware of that. Carol, I saw that you unmuted.
Yeah, and I would agree with Sarah, because we run into this as a support group through the RDAC and the Serving Qualitative Methods Core, where people have unrealistic expectations about the timeline and the budget. And so I was encouraged that was high on the rubric, that discussion happens early, because it's reality. And I think it's jarring for some investigators. But if they have this discussion, then by the time they come to us, it's not us giving them this bad news and knocking them down at the knees of you can't do what you thought you could do. Instead, you've said to them, let's look at what's realistic. You have a great idea, and we're going to help you shape this with the resources that you have.
Thanks, Carol. Yeah, and I think that that points to the importance of, as we've emphasized, bringing researchers in early in the process when there is actually room to make some of those changes and some of those bigger changes in terms of expectation and timeline, and not exclusive to, you know, tweaking little things, but really fundamental shifts. Yeah, Madison, I see you have a hand up.
I just real quickly wanted to say one other thing about that is that what we've found is that we can sort of chunk things out, especially with early stage investigators, to say, like, don't tackle it all. And Anna's great at this. Don't take it all on, and parse it out and start small.
Let's see. So I'll read Tiffany's because I see hers in the chat. Looking at the strengths and the connections that you, the researcher, are aware of or have made in the intended community. And then similar to Sarah's point of just the incentive or the kind of financial compensation to be able to support the community for their time, their expertise.
Thanks, Madison. Yeah, that's really important. Beverly, I see your hands up also.
I just actually have a general question. I'm trying to think about how useful this is. And actually, I have an early career investigator that presented before you guys about a month or two ago, and he thought it was incredibly helpful. What do you think is the ideal timing for an investigator to talk with the coalition? Because, you know, should it be during the conception of the proposal or after funding is already obtained? And I'm asking that because I think having this availability of the coalition to be written into grant proposals is actually would strengthen the proposal. So just wondering what people think about that.
I can offer some experience that we've had at Harvard Catalyst, which is there were a series of pilot grants where we actually offered this kind of review as people, like, they basically put in their letter of intent. The people who, you know, the top 8 or whatever it was, got to go through this review process between having submitted the letter of intent and submitting the actual proposal. And it was fantastically helpful. So, you know, just as one example, we had one on LGBTQ plus health, and they were looking at like secondary data analysis, right? So you kind of think, oh, that data exists, like we can't really do anything. But the panel was able to give feedback on, you know, if you address your question a certain way, you're leaving out this entire swath of the LGBTQ plus population. If you change your question slightly, it is so much more inclusive. So even a small thing like that. And so then when they gave us the proposal, it was just dramatically more useful, right? In terms of like policymakers or whoever. So I would say the ideal would be when you have enough in place that you have a sense of like the methods, the population, all of those details, like a pretty decent draft, but you haven't gotten so close to the submission date or so tied to your budgets or whatever that you can't change things would be ideal. Because coming with an unshaped idea isn't helpful. Coming with a too formally shaped idea isn't helpful. So that I think that sort of middle ground is great. But then I would also say if folks got funding and haven't had any kind of equity review like this, they can still come and they can still, you know, change instruments, change recruitment processes, all of those things. You know, there are still tweaks to be made. And we've had that experience in the coalition as well, where people have come with funded work and still been able to make changes. Yeah, that's a great question.
I actually had a follow-up question, even though I'm presenting, but I'm curious, Shoba, if we would ever have the opportunity to have a discussion with somebody at more than one distinct point in the process, like bring someone back even 6 months or a year later, is that something that we could do?
Yeah, that's something we've been thinking about is, you know, how do we bring people back? Because they may, you know, need the help with the proposal, but then once they get the money, all of this becomes really real. And then again, yeah, I think coming back would make a lot of sense. And even in the meantime, you know, Becca has provided support to folks post-review, but has also, there's been a couple times where they've set small group meetings for additional feedback from a small group of coalition members, sort of as a separate activity, you know, funded separately, but that even just multiple touch points in one time period can be very helpful, I think.
And I think that would be really exciting from the perspective of a coalition member to be able to see the evolution of the study. Yeah.
And I've been part of those smaller, like after the fact groups that emerge, and those have been really, really helpful for both the coalition members and the researchers. They come in with more data or have more time to further iron out and explain at, you know, whatever it was that they presented at the first meeting. So those have been really, really fruitful as well.
Great. Well, I think in the interest of time, we need to move on. But yeah, Glavie's going to tell us what really happened.
Yeah, so thank you for that transition, and thank you so much for your ideas, because a lot of what, you know, Sarah, for instance, a lot of what you have mentioned, the coalition had also considered, and a lot of those ideas have emerged into what the rubric actually looks today. So after the coalition members basically read the study summaries and watch the brief video created by the researchers to further explain the research, we as coalition members then take the time to complete the rubric. And this rubric is really unique because it focuses on the information and we basically sum it up in the 4 areas that you see on the screen: the planning stages, the recruitment and consent phases, participation, and also the dissemination of all the data. The 4 sections are then rated by us in the degree in which each health equity consideration was addressed in the study. The rating scale grades each of the sections as whether it was not applicable, not addressed, somewhat addressed, or fully addressed. So in the first section of the rubric, which is the planning considerations phase, that is graded. And here we evaluate whether the study goals actually address issues of various issues of health equity. We assess how diverse the study team and the research team is. We identify whether the researcher demonstrates established relationships with community partners and key stakeholders. And, you know, having an established mechanism to ensure accountability to community partners is paramount, and it's something that we briefly have been mentioning here today. The coalition does identify how transparent conversations on budgets may be also within the study, the different roles of the researchers, as well as the clarity on ownership and authorship of any published materials that may emerge from the study. Another section is the recruitment and consent considerations section of the rubric. And in this section, the coalition analyzes that the study recruitment materials and the language that is being used is welcoming, that it is inclusive, and that it does promote belonging. This may include any and all handouts and pamphlets that their study researchers were able to provide to us. We encourage that the researchers spend time seriously considering that the study consenting process ensures that the study participants have time to consider and fully understand all activities, all of the risks and benefits that this research might entail before deciding to participate in their study. Did the researchers consider the involvement of any and all trusted patient advocacy and community groups that serve diverse populations in the recruitment process? So that is really important because this step is imperative, as we know. We look at any mention of incentives and compensation. So again, aligning with what Sarah was mentioning earlier. So we look at what kind of compensation is being offered to the research participants. Additionally, the reflection of diversity in regards to many different layers, including race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, is key in the studies that the study staff that is conducting the recruitment for the research. Again, our rubric includes looking at all of the recruitment and consent materials and their accessibility in regards to various different reading levels, making sure that plain language with limited jargon is utilized and that the materials are offered in not only in multiple languages, but that appropriate images as well as information being provided is also offered in various formats, whether it be printed, digital, and what have you. It's also important that the enrollment plan matches and is very similar to the demographics of the clinical population that is being studied in the research. Then we have the participation considerations section of the rubric is really important because there we are looking at how the study design, both the experimental and also the control groups are all key, and all key outcomes are being defined and how clear the researchers are in doing so. We see if, to make sure that the participant burden is clear and one that really minimizes any and all potential harms to the research participants. The coalition also considers the costs of participation, which includes anything from meals, transportation, possible childcare for the participants, and whether these are covered or not in the research. Our rubric also includes a section identifying all of the study exclusions and whether the researchers had good reasoning to justify these exclusions. We also look at the various measures and methods that are discussed and how free these are from assumptions and of the participants, which, for example, family structure and dynamics, various housing needs and technology access, and the varying levels of skills participants may have. A very important aspect is how opportunities for participation are offered to potential study participants in ways that are really tailored to low resource communities, in ways that leverage trusted partners, and that also consider potential social and emotional needs of all participants. Then the final section in our rubric, the dissemination considerations section, is where we look into whether the dissemination plan of the study in question considers real world translations and includes both practitioner and community audiences. So here we see if there's a clear plan for the return of the results of the study. So for instance, what results will be shared with which participants, and we analyze the quality and framing of these results that are being disclosed to the participants. How timely is the return of these results, and do they mention a process to address the needs and preferences and values of all stakeholders involved? It's important that the dissemination products are accessible in many levels, which again includes reading levels and making sure that plain language is being used and that all jargon is avoided or limited in all possible capacities. We also look into whether there exists a plan, any budget to support community partners in dissemination activities, and if the dissemination of these results and data are being done in a very thoughtful way. So finally, each coalition member gets to highlight what the major health equity strengths and particular research of the projects that are being looked at, as well as we're all able to comment on the top priority change that will promote equity in that particular research study. So as you can see, the rubric is very robust, but as Shoba and Elana has alluded to earlier, we're always tweaking and looking for ideas to make our rubric even more comprehensive and useful for the researchers and everyone involved.
Thank you, Glavie. If you are interested in a copy of the full rubric, there's a piece coming out shortly. It's been accepted with minor revisions that we can send around that really talks through the entire coalition structure and has the full rubric at the end. So that'll be a useful resource. We just wanted to sort of close this out with one example of a study that went through the process. So there was a researcher who had funding to look at a grocery provision program for Black residents of Boston to stop hypertension, Go Fresh as they call it. And their question was, if we have a weekly grocery delivery that's modeled after the DASH diet, which is dietary approaches to stop hypertension, will that lower blood pressure among Black adults in Boston? So they came to the study, they came to the coalition, presented their work, got a lot of great feedback. And some of the strengths that were highlighted, and again, as both Glavie and Elana noted, we always start with the strengths, right? Because we see a lot of them and also want folks to be able to listen to the suggestions afterwards. But they took a really structural view of factors that are driving health inequity. They positioned hunger as a social issue throughout. They had very inclusive recruitment processes with meaningful incentives, so real money. And we keep talking about money, but that just seems to come up again and again, is are you making things accessible? Are you paying people for their time? Are you budgeting for dissemination? It just keeps coming up. And then participant autonomy and food choices. So some of these studies will basically tell you what you're going to eat. And you can imagine how well that works for people. So the key suggestions they got were to get to hire a staff member who has lived experience aligned with the population, to improve the inclusivity of recruitment materials, to showcase the folks who are actually going to be participating in the study. And then this was, I thought, the most creative one, to look at sourcing groceries from local and Black-owned businesses instead of Amazon Fresh. I don't think that would have occurred to any of the researchers on the team. And then after someone said it, a light bulb went off, and now we're seeing this in so many other studies of ways in which small and local businesses can be supported, through these large grants. So the kinds of changes that they've made and planned is they created a recruiter position and their hiring process is prioritizing Black Bostonians. They have found a number of local outlets, sort of local media, local channels to recruit people of color, Black Bostonians to the study, and then also emphasize people of color in the materials. They've expanded options to include Instacart, so that way the person can actually choose to shop at local and Black-owned businesses as part of their grocery delivery plan. They have a Black dietitian as their consultant, and then they're hiring others. And then they have intake forms that prioritize a range of languages, recognizing the diversity of the Black diaspora in Boston, right? And again, trying to be more inclusive in their recruitment processes. And then finally, showcasing chefs with diverse backgrounds who have a lot of different cultural traditions. And all of these things, I think for those of us who do a lot of engaged research, feel pretty natural in terms of kinds of tweaks, right, that one would make. This kind of expertise is not always sought out or available to many researchers. And I think that's the beauty of, in one place, in a couple of hours of effort, imagine how much this study transforms in terms of redirecting resources locally, creating something that is scalable locally, all of those things. So, and I can brag about it because I didn't do any of this thought work. This is all the coalition. So I think it's really an exciting way where we can think about, sort of like almost like multi-level changes to these studies that reshape the work. So we will stop there. I know we just have actually we have 10 minutes left. I just want to highlight that, again, the U54 Outreach Corps is a service corps. If you are a U54 researcher, please reach out to us. Tiffany Donaldson and I co-direct it. As we said, Glavie is one of our community advisory board members. We would love to be of use in any way. And if you're interested in learning more about the Community Coalition for Equity and Research, feel free to email us, especially, if we have some of these UMB DFHCC partnerships, we can access the coalition that way for UMB researchers. So I think Madison's going to throw that information into the chat for us. Thank you. So you have that. And yeah, we'll just stop screen sharing and then see what folks have to say.
Thank you all so much for that great presentation. I just want to tie back to a question we had in the chat about the rubric in terms of authorship. And just Satara was wondering if the coalition considers researchers being offered or offering community members kind of authorship on future manuscripts, or kind of what considerations around authorship come into play for the rubric, if any?
That's a great question. I don't know that we have thought about it that way. I think certainly some researchers have asked if some of the coalition members would like to be sort of consultants or advisors on a study. And I think in that way, that's how we operate, is certainly all of our community advisors are co-authors on our work. But I think that would be a researcher-based decision. But I think more broadly, it's an interesting question to ask now that especially we have this sort of citable resource to give the coalition credit in that way for the review process. I think seems really doable and really appropriate. And so I think that's a really nice suggestion. Thank you.
Thank you.
This is so exciting. I feel like, what you've built here has an opportunity to get at some systemic and structural turns that we keep finding ourselves in. Sometimes it feels like Groundhog Day, having conversations around the same things, but you guys have put something in place that I think will really make measurable change. And I'm really excited to learn about it. So thank you for doing it.
Thank you. Yeah, I think so. I think between Karen Emmons and Michael Curry, whose brainchild all of this was, I think they were seeing exactly that. They've been asked the same questions for the last 15, 20 years, and there doesn't seem to be any movement. And I think offering a structure really helps. But then I think even things like the rubric, even if you didn't come to the coalition, there is something that you can look at and have an internal, like, stakeholder-driven discussion about how are we doing on these things and where can we be better. And I would like to think that there are a lot of folks, if you give them those supports, they'll take them and run. Yeah. Prajakta, I don't know if you're available to if you're somewhere where you can jump in, but I was just curious if the CPCRN equity kind of checklists and review and things like that might resonate. And I don't know when you jumped onto the call, but I know you guys do a lot of work sort of thinking about how do you systematize the centering of equity.
Yeah. Well, I just found your tweet and I joined in because I had like a meeting get canceled. So I was like, oh, this is interesting. I'm coming. I did join in when you were talking about the specifics of the rubrics and how you do the process. So that was very, very exciting to note. I think in the Cancer Prevention, Cancer Control Research Network, CPCRN, we've really been sort of going more empirical right now in seeing how CPCRN investigators are promoting equity in the processes that they are engaging in. I think you guys are like maybe 10 steps ahead of us in that you actually have a process that's been put, like someone initially mentioned, there is a structure. The structure is I think we are going towards that direction, Shoba, but right now we are very much in, these are some of the key principles in which we think that equity can be promoted. I loved the example that you gave, the groceries for Black residents.
What he did.
Amazing. That's like the key. I think we are like a few steps away from saying, what are the key ways in which we make some of these changes in that equity becomes a part of the process as well as the outcome. So that's where we are right now, but amazing to listen and do all of this. And I'm so glad I got that tweet. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. Yeah, no, I think it's going to be really great as there's more work in this area to also think about, as you guys are thinking about how are people doing this, then maybe the rubric expands also, and we have a chance to kind of give people additional opportunities to think about integrating equity. So yeah, thank you.
We
Anything
did
else?
have a question about whether projects are funded pre or post. Are most projects coming to you pre or post funding?
I think we've gotten both so far. I don't know what the distribution is. Glavie or Elana, do you know? There's offhand now. I'm not sure, but we certainly have had people who are actually like fairly down the pipe where they've already had studies underway, and then maybe they're adding a section to it. So there's decision making to be made there, but the rest of it is highly constrained because they're already in the field, a couple of years in. And then we've had folks who just got funding, and then folks who are about to apply for funding.
Thanks. I was just curious.
There has been a range of levels of positions that folks have come in with. So everyone from postdoc to full professor, so that's also been really nice to see. You can imagine people come in as postdocs or early career investigators, and they get this feedback. Not only does it reshape the study, but hopefully it reshapes like some of their ability to integrate equity considerations.
I just wanted to jump in really quick over there, Shoba, because that's one of the most common complaints that we see come through, that this is how the NIH wants it, or this is how how we said that we would do this study, and now it might be a bit too late to like incorporate some of these factors in. And so I loved that the example that you provided was somebody who had come up with a plan and had thought through the coalition efforts, then like, how can I make it more sustainable and equity oriented? So there is always an opportunity in my head to like do this. So I hope that's not a factor that becomes a barrier at all for any investigators at any stage.
I guess maybe the other way to think of it also is that the coalition offers so many different kinds of suggestions that there just have to be a chunk of them that won't impact your design and won't impact, this, that, and the other. And so there's always room for movement, it seems. Great. Should we stop there, Anna?
That sounds great. I just wanted to thank everyone so much, both for presenting as well as participating.